The first splash was a mistake. Quiet, instinctive, and human, but it was the sound that changed everything. Because the moment my boots broke the glassy surface of the lake, I felt it in my chest, the strange sensation you get when peace is about to be punished. I had lived beside that lake for 12 years, breathed with it, listened to it thaw and freeze, watched fog crawl across it like a living thing at dawn, and never once did I imagine that stepping into its cold embrace would become the spark for a war that would swallow an entire neighborhood whole. I didn't know then that someone was watching from behind tinted sunglasses, lips pressed thin with satisfaction, fingers already itching to write a citation that would cost me $1,000 and my innocence in one stroke. That lake wasn't just water to me. It was memory, therapy, and sanctuary. I bought the land long before the HOA fences went up, before the sidewalks were poured straight and narrow like prison corridors, before rules were laminated and worshipped. My deed was older than their bylaws, older than their obsession with order, and older than the woman who would eventually make it her mission to break me. I had swum in that lake since my beard was thinner and my heart less tired. I'd fished there after burying my father. I'd floated there on my back during heat waves when the world felt too loud. That morning, I waded in because the water called me the way it always did, low and patient, promising quiet in exchange for surrender. I didn't hear her footsteps at first. I was waist-deep, breath slowing, muscles loosening, when the voice cut through the air like a blade dragged across glass. "Excuse me." Sharp, commanding, practiced. I turned, water dripping from my sleeves, and there she stood on the bank like a monument to entitlement. She wore a power-red pantsuit so vivid it looked hostile against the green trees, her sharp bob perfectly aligned as if it too followed regulations. Her eyes weren't curious or confused, they were thrilled. "You are violating HOA Regulation 14B, she said, holding up her phone as if it were a badge. "No resident may enter the lake without written authorization from the board." I stared at her, stunned, then laughed, actually laughed because the absurdity felt unreal. "This is my lake," I said calmly. "It's on my property, always has been." She smiled then, a thin curve that never touched her eyes. "Incorrect," she said. "The HOA has recreational jurisdiction." That word, jurisdiction, echoed in my head long after she walked away, heels clicking like a countdown timer. 2 days later, the letter arrived. Official, cold. $1,000 fine for unauthorized lake usage, plus a warning that repeat violations would incur escalating penalties. I held the paper in my hands, fingers trembling, not from fear but from something darker, something slower and more dangerous. Rage doesn't always explode. Sometimes it sinks, settles, and waits. I went to the HOA meeting. Of course I did. I wore my old sweater, the one that smelled faintly of pine and lake water, because I wanted to remember who I was before all this. She was there at the front, presiding like a queen, her red suit replaced by a crisp white blouse that somehow felt even more threatening. When I spoke, she didn't listen. When I showed my deed, she smiled. When I explained the history of the land, she tapped her pen and said, "Rules are rules." The room felt smaller with every word. That was the moment something inside me changed. Not snapped. Changed. I realized she wasn't enforcing rules to protect the community. She was feeding on control, on the power of telling people no, on watching their shoulders slump as she won. And I understood then that appealing to reason would only nourish her. If I wanted peace, I'd have to earn it the hard way. I paid the fine. That part surprised her. I saw it in her eyes when she checked the ledger and found my account settled in full. No protest, no appeal, just compliance. She expected resistance. What she didn't expect was patience. That night I walked the shoreline with a lantern, listening to the frogs and the wind through the reeds, letting the lake calm me while my mind sharpened. I knew the rules better than she did, had read them years ago out of boredom, never thinking they'd matter. And buried deep in those pages were provisions, clauses written by people who loved control as much as she did, but who never imagined someone might turn them inward like a blade. The HOA funded itself through shared amenity maintenance fees, adjustable by resident vote if justified by extraordinary circumstances. The lake, according to their own documents, was the crown jewel of those amenities. The irony tasted sweet. If the lake required maintenance, if it posed risks, if it needed management, then fees could rise substantially. I didn't rush. Revenge, like fishing, requires stillness. First, I documented everything. Every goose nest disturbed by unauthorized landscaping, every chemical runoff from manicured lawns seeping into the water, every unpermitted kayak launch by residents who thought the rules didn't apply to them. I installed discreet cameras, not hidden, just quiet, capturing erosion caused by HOA-approved construction. I kept logs, photographs, water samples. The lake became my witness. Then I started talking, casually, gently, at barbecues, by mailboxes, during evening walks. I spoke of algae blooms and liability, of insurance nightmares and environmental audits. I never mentioned her name. I let fear do its work naturally. When the next HOA meeting came, I didn't sit in the back. I stood. I presented my findings slowly, methodically, my voice steady as the lake at dawn. Faces changed as I spoke. Murmurs grew. She tried to interrupt me once, twice, but the room wasn't hers anymore. When I finished, I proposed a motion, an immediate increase in HOA fees to fund lake preservation, safety monitoring, and restricted access enforcement. $5,000 per household. The room erupted. She stood, furious, her composure cracking for the first time. "This is outrageous," she snapped. I met her gaze, calm as water. "Rules are rules," I said. The vote passed. The aftermath was beautiful and terrible. Residents who once praised her turned cold. Questions piled up. She deflected, blamed, spun, but the numbers didn't lie. Fees were due, accounts drained, smiles vanished. And through it all, I stayed silent, watching from the shore as the lake reflected a sky heavy with consequence. She confronted me one evening as the sun dipped low, her red suit back on like armor, but it looked faded now. "You did this," she hissed. I nodded. "I fined you for swimming in your own lake," I said softly. "I raised fees to protect it." Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she had nothing. I stepped into the water that night, fully clothed, letting it soak me to the bone. The lake welcomed me home, and for the first time in months, I felt peace. Not because I had won, but because I had reclaimed what was always mine. The days after the vote felt unreal, like the quiet after a storm when debris is still falling from the sky and you're not sure what will hit next, because the neighborhood changed its posture toward me overnight. People watching from behind curtains, conversations stopping when I passed. And yet, beneath that tension, there was something else growing, respect mixed with fear, and I carried both like weight in my chest as I returned to my routines, tending the shoreline, testing the water, walking the lake at dawn with mist curling around my boots while I felt her presence even when she wasn't there. Because HOA Karen did not know how to retreat gracefully, and control addicts never accept defeat, they only regroup. She started knocking on doors, gathering signatures, whispering that I was dangerous, unstable, obsessed, that I had manipulated the community, and when that didn't work, she escalated, issuing petty citations for grass height, mailbox alignment, trash can angles, anything to remind people she still had teeth. And I watched it all with a calm that surprised even me, because I understood now that desperation makes people sloppy, and sloppy people make mistakes. One evening, as I was repairing an old dock plank with the steady rhythm that always soothed me, I noticed fresh tire tracks near the water where none should have been, deep grooves cutting toward the reeds, and my stomach tightened, not with fear, but with certainty, because I knew exactly who would break the very rules she worshipped if it meant regaining power. I checked the cameras that night, the soft glow of the screen lighting my cabin as the truth unfolded frame by frame. There she was, in her red suit, heels sinking into mud, supervising a contractor as they dumped gravel along the shore, unauthorized, unpermitted, directly violating the environmental buffer zone she herself had cited dozens of residents for breaching in the past. And I felt a slow smile spread across my face. Not joy, not malice, but inevitability. I waited 3 days, letting her dig deeper, letting invoices pile up, letting the damage become undeniable. Then I called an emergency HOA meeting myself, citing the same clauses she once weaponized against me. And when the room filled, she arrived confident, smug even, until I played the footage, until I laid out the costs of remediation, the fines the HOA would face under its own bylaws, the legal exposure that would fall squarely on the board member who authorized the work. And I watched her face drain of color as the room turned on her, voices rising, accusations flying, the same people she had fined now demanding answers. And when she tried to speak, her voice cracked, just slightly, enough to betray the fear underneath. And that was when I leaned forward and spoke softly, telling them there was only one way to protect the community from further loss: a special assessment, temporary but necessary, targeted at the responsible party to cover damages and restore trust. And the silence that followed was thick and heavy like water before a plunge, until someone clapped, then another, and the vote passed without resistance, because people are quick to embrace justice when it doesn't cost them anything. She didn't look at me as she left, didn't shout, didn't threaten, just walked out with her shoulders stiff and her power-red suit smeared with lake mud. And in that moment, I felt something loosen inside me. Not triumph, but release. Because revenge wasn't loud or cruel the way movies promised. It was quiet, procedural, and devastating in its precision. Weeks later, when her house went up for sale and the new board quietly rewrote the lake regulations to acknowledge what had always been true, I stood waist-deep in the water again, the cold biting, the sun breaking through clouds, and I let myself float, hearing nothing but my own breath and the gentle lap of waves against my chest, knowing the lake had tested me, taught me patience, and given me back more than it ever took. And as I drifted there, eyes closed, I understood that some battles aren't won by force or authority, but by endurance, by knowing the land, by becoming so still that those who seek control drown in their own need to dominate while you remain, like water, impossible to own and impossible to silence. The lake changed after that, not in the way water changes when seasons turn, but in the way silence changes when someone who used to shout finally leaves the room. It became heavier, deeper somehow, as if it had absorbed everything that had happened and was holding it for me alone. I felt it every morning when I stepped outside, the air colder against my beard, the water darker at the edges, and I understood that even though she was gone from the board, HOA Karen was not finished. People like her don't disappear when they lose power. They shrink, condense, and wait for another opening. And I could sense her waiting the way animals sense a predator they can't see yet. At first, the neighborhood pretended everything was normal. Smiles returned, fees were paid, meetings were shorter, quieter. But beneath that calm, resentment simmered. $5,000 doesn't vanish from people's lives without leaving scars. And while many knew she was to blame, it was easier to look at me, the man by the lake, the one who started it all. I heard the whispers when I passed. I felt the looks linger too long. I became a symbol, and symbols are dangerous because people project their anger onto them, whether it's deserved or not. I leaned into solitude. The lake had always understood me better than people anyway. I spent long hours repairing the shoreline damage she'd caused, hauling stones by hand, sinking posts deep into the mud, my muscles burning while my mind stayed sharp. Every ache reminded me I was still in control of my body, my land, my choices. At night, I replayed the camera footage, not from fear, but habit, scanning for patterns, for signs of movement that didn't belong. Control, I had learned, was best countered by awareness. That's when the letters started. They weren't official at first, no headerhead, no signatures, just envelopes slipped into my mailbox late at night, the paper inside thick and expensive, the words printed, never handwritten. You don't own the lake. This isn't over. People are watching you. I felt a flicker of something cold the first time, not fear exactly, more like recognition. This was her language, passive, deniable, designed to unsettle without leaving fingerprints. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need witnesses. I needed leverage.
I kept the letters, sealed in plastic, cataloged by date and time. I adjusted the cameras slightly, widening angles, sharpening night contrast. I walked the perimeter more often, sometimes stopping suddenly just to listen, letting the night reveal itself. Owls, frogs, wind, and once the soft crunch of gravel where no one should have been. I didn't confront her when I saw her again. That would have been a mistake. She stood across the road one afternoon pretending to inspect a yard sign, her red suit replaced by muted gray, but the posture was the same, rigid, defensive, her eyes flicking toward the lake like it was a living insult. I felt a surge of anger then, hot and fast, but I let it pass, breathing it out until all that remained was focus.
A week later, the HOA announced a special compliance review of all lake-adjacent properties. I smiled when I read the notice. They were using her old playbook, digging for violations, hoping to regain a sense of order by tightening the leash. But I knew that book better than anyone now, knew where the margins were thin and the footnotes dangerous. I welcomed the inspectors with tea and calm answers, walked them through every structure, every boundary marker, every permit. They left frustrated, empty-handed, their authority dulled by preparation. That night, someone sabotaged my dock. They didn't destroy it outright. That would have been obvious. They loosened bolts, shifted supports just enough that the structure groaned under weight. Subtle, malicious, designed to hurt, not announce itself. I found that at dawn, 1 foot on the planks, the wood sagging beneath me like a warning whisper from the lake itself. My heart hammered as I stepped back, the realization sinking in that this was no longer about fees or fines. This was personal. I sat on the shore for a long time after that, boots in the water, letting the cold numb my anger while my thoughts sharpened. She wanted me reckless, wanted me angry, wanted me to lash out so she could point and say, "See, he's dangerous." I wouldn't give her that. Instead, I did what water does best. I adapted. I repaired the dock better than before, reinforcing it, documenting every step. Then I let it slip just a little that I was installing new equipment, expensive equipment, that the lake was becoming not just a sanctuary, but a resource. I talked about research, conservation grants, future value. I watched the rumors ripple outward, watched greed and fear do what they always do, draw predators. And one night, long past midnight, the cameras caught her again. She moved differently this time. No suit, dark clothes, careful steps. She approached the dock, testing it, unaware of how visible she was to me, sitting inside with the screen glowing like a quiet eye. She reached into her bag, pulled out tools, and that was the moment something inside me went utterly still. Not rage, not panic, clarity. I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront her. I let her work. Because the most devastating revenge isn't stopping someone. It's letting them fully reveal who they are. She tampered with the dock again, more aggressively this time, damaging enough to be unmistakable. When she left, breathless, victorious in her small cruelty, I waited until morning. Then I did something she never expected. I invited the neighborhood. I hosted an open lake day, framed as a peace offering, a way to heal divisions, to reconnect with what made this place beautiful. People came cautiously at first, then in waves. Children laughed, adults relaxed. The lake shimmered under the sun like it was proud of itself. And when I guided them to the dock, carefully, deliberately, I showed them the damage, the fresh tool marks, the danger it posed to anyone who might have stepped there unawares. I didn't accuse, I presented facts, evidence, footage. The silence that followed was suffocating. Faces turned, whispers erupted. Someone said her name aloud, and it spread like fire. By the end of the day, she wasn't just isolated, she was exposed, not by law, not by authority, but by the collective judgment of the people she once controlled. And I watched from the water's edge, emotions churning, satisfaction tangled with sadness, knowing this wasn't the end yet, but feeling for the first time that the lake, the land, and I were moving together, patient and unstoppable, toward a conclusion she did no longer outrun. The shift after that day was subtle but unmistakable, like the way pressure changes before a storm breaks. People stopped whispering when I passed because they no longer needed to. What had been suspicion hardened into certainty, and certainty has weight. It presses down on a person until they either confess or collapse under it. HOA Karen did neither. She disappeared instead, and that worried me more than her presence ever had. Her house went dark, curtains drawn, car unmoved. For 3 days no one saw her. On the 4th, I found another letter in my mailbox, heavier than the others, the paper creased as if gripped too tightly. This time there was no threat, no accusation, just 4 words, printed in stark black. You made me do this. I stood there for a long time, the lake breathing behind me, my reflection faint in the mailbox's metal. A chill creeped up my spine. Not fear, but the awareness that the story had crossed another invisible line. When people stop blaming others and start justifying themselves, things escalate. I folded the letter carefully and added it to the growing file, my hands steady despite the weight in my chest. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay listening to the lake, to the creak of trees, to every imagined footstep. My mind replayed every interaction, every look she had given me, searching for what I might have missed. Control was always her oxygen. I'd taken that away. Now she was suffocating, and suffocating people claw. Around 2 in the morning, the power cut out. The sudden silence was total, oppressive. No hum of appliances, no distant lights, just darkness and the sound of water lapping gently against shore. I didn't panic. I reached for the lantern by instinct, its warm glow pushing back the dark, and moved toward the window. The neighborhood was blacked out, but the lake reflected the moon faintly, a silver eye watching everything. Then I saw movement.
Shadow near the far tree line, closer than it should have been. Too deliberate to be an animal. My pulse quickened, but my breathing stayed slow. I picked up the binoculars, hands steady and focused. There she was, hair pulled back, face pale, jaw tight with something like resolve or madness. She carried a container in one hand, sloshing slightly as she walked toward the water. My stomach dropped. I didn't rush out. I didn't shout. That would have been what she wanted. Chaos, confrontation, a chance to paint herself as the wronged party pushed too far. Instead, I watched. Cameras recorded. The lake held its breath. She knelt at the shoreline, unscrewed the lid, and poured. The smell hit even through the closed window. Chemical, sharp, wrong. My fists clenched as she emptied the container into the shallows, muttering to herself, words I couldn't hear but could imagine. This was her final tantrum, her attempt to poison what she couldn't own. And in that moment, something inside me hardened, not into anger, but into resolve so cold it felt calm. When she left, disappearing back into the darkness, I waited another full minute. Then I moved. I suited up quickly, waders pulled on, gloves tight, lantern swinging low. I stepped into the lake, the cold biting, grounding me, reminding me why I was doing this. I worked fast but carefully, deploying absorbent barriers I'd kept for emergencies I'd always hoped would never come. I skimmed the surface, contained the damage, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with urgency. The lake had given me peace for years. Tonight, it needed me. My dawn, the worst of it was contained. I documented everything. Samples, footage, timestamps. I was exhausted, soaked to the bone, but my mind was razor sharp. She had crossed from control into sabotage, from petty tyranny into something that couldn't be ignored. Not by authorities, I wouldn't give her that stage, but by the community she'd terrorized. I called for another gathering, this time at sunrise, framing it as urgent, environmental, collective. People came bleary-eyed, confused, concerned. I showed them the footage. I showed them the water samples. I showed them the letters, the sabotage, the pattern. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I let the truth do the work. Faces went pale. Someone cried. Someone swore under their breath. And when I finally said her name, it wasn't with anger, but with sadness, the kind that makes people uncomfortable because it feels earned. "She tried to destroy the lake," I said quietly. "Not me, not the HOA, the lake." That was the moment she lost everything. Neighbors who once feared her now saw her as a threat, not legally, not formally, but socially, and that kind of judgment is relentless. She was confronted on her own doorstep later that day, not by me, but by the people she'd fined, shamed, and controlled for years. They didn't yell, they didn't threaten. They told her she was no longer welcome, not at meetings, not in conversations, not in their lives. Isolation is a powerful thing. It strips away masks faster than any punishment. A week later, she left. No announcement, no apology, just a moving truck and silence. Her house stood empty for months, a hollow reminder of what happens when control becomes obsession. I returned to the lake alone that evening, stepping into the water as the sun dipped low, the surface calm once more. The lake hadn't forgotten, but it had forgiven. As I floated there, eyes closed, feeling the gentle pull of water against my body, I understood something deeply and finally. Revenge didn't have to be loud or violent. It didn't have to destroy. Sometimes it simply reveals. And in that revelation, those who live by control find themselves with nothing left to hold. The lake remained. I remained. And that was enough. The house stayed empty longer than anyone expected, and that emptiness began to feel like a held breath that never quite released. Seasons shifted around it. Leaves gathered on the driveway and were blown away again. Snow settled on the roof and melted into long, dark streaks. Every time I walked the lake, I could feel the echo of her absence the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. Not pain, just awareness. The community relaxed in small, cautious ways, like animals stepping back into a clearing after a predator moves on. But none of us forgot what unchecked control had almost cost us. I tried to return to the simple rituals that had always grounded me. Dawn walks with steam rising off the water, repairing nets and lines, sitting on the old stump by the shore and listening. Yet peace doesn't snap back into place like a rule book does. It has to be coaxed, earned again. Some mornings I'd wake with a tightness in my chest, convinced I'd hear footsteps outside or find another letter waiting. Other mornings, the lake would be so still it felt like forgiveness itself, and I'd let that feeling carry me through the day. The new board rewrote policies carefully, deliberately, with language that respected boundaries rather than invaded them. They invited input. They asked questions. It felt strange at first, like walking on a dock you didn't trust yet, but over time, the planks held. Fees stabilized. Inspections became cooperative instead of punitive. People smiled without watching who might be watching them. The lake was no longer a battleground. It was a shared quiet. I thought that was the ending. I really did. Then, one afternoon near the start of summer, a rental truck rolled back into the neighborhood. I was mending a section of shoreline when I heard it, the low diesel growl, the crunch of tires. My hands stilled. I didn't look up right away. I didn't need to. The lake's surface rippled oddly, disturbed by something unseen, and I felt that old familiar tightening return. Not fear, but readiness. She stepped out of the cab, wearing a simple jacket and jeans, no red in sight. Her hair was longer, pulled back loosely. She looked older, thinner. The armor was gone, replaced by something fragile and human, and that unsettled me more than the power suit ever did. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the water as if it might speak first. I walked up beside her, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to pretend indifference. We stood in silence, the lake between us, reflecting the sky like it always had, impartial and vast. "I'm selling the house," she said finally. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, worn at the edges. "Closing today." I nodded. I didn't offer sympathy. I didn't offer blame. I waited. "I didn't come to start anything," she added too quickly. I wanted to see it again before I go." The lake lapped gently at the shore, unconcerned. I studied her reflection in the water, how it wavered, broke, reformed.
Control never was about rules, I realized then. It was about fear, hers most of all. "You tried to poison it," I said calmly, not accusing, just stating a fact the way one states the weather. Her shoulders sagged. "I know." We stood there longer, the silence stretching but not snapping. When she spoke again, her words surprised me. She thought if I could make it smaller, if I could make it obey, then everything else would fall into line. She let out a breath that sounded like defeat. I could have said many things then. I could have reminded her of the fines, the threats, the nights spent watching cameras instead of sleeping. I could have claimed victory, taken one last piece of her pride. Instead, I did what the lake had taught me to do. I said nothing. She nodded to herself, as if that silence answered everything she needed to know. Then she turned and walked back to the truck. No confrontation, no apology speech, just a woman leaving a place she could never bend to her will. When the truck disappeared down the road, the lake seemed to exhale. I felt it in my own lungs, a deep grounding breath that reached places anger never could. I stepped into the water, boots sinking into the cool mud, and let the chill wash over me, steady and honest. The lake accepted me without ceremony, as it always had. That evening I swam freely, fully, the way I had before any of this began. The water held me, dark and vast and alive, and as I floated on my back watching the sky fade into stars, I understood the true shape of what had happened. Revenge hadn't been about hurting her. It had been about refusing to be made smaller. It had been about patience, endurance, and letting truth surface on its own time. The lake kept its secrets, but it kept its balance. And in the end, so did I.